Hi everyone, welcome back to week 9 of Augmenting the Gallery. This week we're talking about virtual museums after we've talked about physical museums. We've talked about physical museums last week. And before we get started, I would like to do the usual housekeeping. So by the time you look at this video or by recitation, which is the coming Wednesday, 7th of April, I believe. 8th, actually. By the 8th of April, you should have gotten in touch with your Museum Vierpunkt contact persons, and you should have completed your design documents, which we will discuss in recitation. I'll repeat this part at the end of the lecture, but I can't stress this enough. Come prepared to talk about your design documents. So, now that we've taking care of the practical stuff, let's see what we're going to talk about today. So virtual museums. Virtual museums means that we're talking about how museums deal with being online. And to start that, we're going to start with the challenges of reproduction for a museum. What is reproduction? How has it changed in the 20th century? And how are museums dealing with it in both a conceptual and a practical manner? So we're going to start about discussing a little bit what are the theoretical foundations of this act of reproduction. And then once we've laid that out, we're going to talk about the process of communicating that reproduction, which means digitizing, presenting, and exposing as best as possible inside a digital world the collection and the resources of those museums. And then once we've seen how different museums approach different patterns of being present online, we're going to talk about how the visitors actually interact with museum websites, museum applications, and the virtual version of the museum, and to what extent does it actually correlate with some of the extrapolations or some of the thoughts that the museums thought would work out in the early 2000s. And then finally, we'll see how that has switched today and how the relationship between the idea of the reproduction, the sort of first initial trials of those museums confronted with the practices of the visitors online, have given us where we are at today and some of the rooms for improvement that you and I can be thinking about as we're developing your project for Museum Vierpunkt. So, without further ado, let's start with reproduction. So, reproducing artworks has an ambivalent position, to say the least, in art history. What's wrong with making copies? We always think of copies, at least in Western art history, as something that is wrong, something that is illegal, something that is a forgery, and someone should not be able to be recognized as an artist if they're making copies. And that's because, roughly, this book. This book is written by Giorgio Vasari. It's called The Lives of the Artists, and it was written, I think, in the 15th century, 15th to 16th century. Essentially, it was written at the crux of the Italian Renaissance, and it sort of set the stage for our understanding of artists today. What Vasari talks about in his book is the biography of those exceptional individuals which are artists. So Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo, Cimabue, maybe not as early as Fra Angelico, but the canons, what we understand today is the canon of the Renaissance in Italy. And so he essentially gave the stage to their persona. because up until then, artists weren't really considered as individuals. They were part of a workshop. There was no real distinction between the artist and the artisan, or the craftsperson, as we would call it today. They both worked in a workshop. They both worked in a guild, and it was more about the functionality and the technicality of their skill and of their product than about the uniqueness of their genius or the uniqueness of their vision. So in the 15th to 16th century, Vasari wrote this book. He also designed the Uffizi, which we've mentioned last week, is one of the first museums, or first modern museums in Europe, in which the point was to display the collection of the rulers of Florence at the time. And so in order to display the collection, you're not displaying objects in their functional way. You're displaying objects as a symbol of value, right? And so you need to create new value in the artwork, and if the artwork is no longer used because it's being stored in this gallery, palace, offices built by Vasari or designed by Vasari, you need to find another point for value, right? And that other point for value is going to be on names and tradition. You are now the owner of something that was made by X or by Y or by someone else. Replace X or Y by the name of someone rather than by a particular guild or a particular craft alliance of anonymous workers. So there was a specific understanding of the uniqueness of the artwork, because the unique artwork relates to the unique artist, and the unique artist relates to value, whether it's like social value or economic value. This is how you get it. It has to be made by someone, otherwise it's meaningless. There's sort of a conundrum to that, because first thing you do when you go to a fine art school is you go and you copy the masters, right? So there's this idea of copying and this idea of learning by doing as much as, or trying to do as well as the master in order to get better at it, right? But that stops once you become an artist. Once you get out of art school in Western Europe, at least in Western thought, you're supposed to make your own original work. That differs a little bit in what I know from at least Chinese art history and how Chinese art history influenced Korean and Japanese art history, in such that there's the process of copying, and the process of copying is essential to being a good artist. And you should be able to copy someone up until the point that you can overcome them and then become the master yourself, and then have other people copy your work again. And so that whole process of copying and of reproduction, of creating like the same pieces over and over and over again, is essential to learning. Either in the East or in the West, it's already present in this idea that if I make it myself, I will be appropriated. Or I will appropriate it for myself, and then I therefore understand it better and become a better human being and better at what I do. So there's this tension between the original as creator of value and the original as name and tradition versus learning by doing. Today, when I say today, the 20th century, there is this new question this old question that is being asked in a new way through our new means of reproduction. So either chemical reproduction or digital reproduction, which prompted this very famous text, which you perhaps have read. If you haven't read, it's something that's quoted constantly and that is, in my experience, always misquoted. It's about 17 pages. It's really worth it. I'll put the link in the description, or the link is going to be on the class notes. It's Walter Benjamin talking about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is a very sexy title. But basically, what Benjamin talks about is is how does the status of the work of art change if you can make endless copies of it? And he's not thinking about copy and pasting MP3 files. He's thinking at that time about photography and film, because these are new ways in which you can reproduce an artwork and make it accessible to as many people as possible. And so first of all, he talks about this thing that he calls the aura. And the aura is the unique aspect of the object that you cannot replicate. And that is the time dimension. It's all the historical events, all the different owners, all the things that happened to that particular object, which made it unique. So there's nothing in and of itself at the beginning which makes it unique. It's just it's growing through time, which then gives it this particular dimension, right? You see that a lot in some of the history museums where you have supposedly nondescript objects, but which become important because they're associated with a particular event or they're associated with a particular person. There's a museum in Chongqing, China, about the Chinese Communist Party, and they have the ball of wool that Mao Zedong used to knit when he was on the Long March. So like the ball of wool itself, not that interesting. The fact that the ball of wool went through the Long March with Mao, a little bit more interesting. So that's where the ball of wool, or that's where other artworks would get their aura from, is this going through time. This testimony, as we've said before, this testimony of the things that we can't see anymore. One thing that Benjamin mentions in this text, besides the sort of like original with the aura and the copies of it, is the relationship between tradition and politics. And to give a little bit of context for this text, it was written as a speech in 1934 at the Institute for the Study of Fascism. And so the big question is the big question in Europe at the time is the rise of fascism and how do we deal with that, right? And Benjamin's response is that by preserving the aura, you're also preserving tradition, and therefore you're preserving conservatism, and you're preserving clinging to the past without taking into account how the present is modifying the object that you're looking at. And so he's saying, and he's often quoted as saying that the aura of an object decreases as you reproduce it. You have the surprise again, the Mona Lisa, and you have all those copies of the Mona Lisa, and it's never quite the same because it's just a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. He finds that dangerous because to him, this sort of fetishizing of tradition and this fetishizing of the past leads directly to fascism and fascist tendencies. And I'll let you guys read the whole text to see how his argument is made, but that's basically the bottom line. And so his proposal is that we use the means of chemical reproduction, we use the means of photography and of film in order to include the masses, or include as many people as possible in the process of producing and of receiving art. It's no longer just a painting that's in a wall somewhere in a building in which you can only access between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. and you have to pay a certain amount and you have to live in a particular city. No, everybody can have their version of their photography of the thing that they desired. And that for him is very important for democracy, because you are including people inside this artistic process. And that in itself is turning art into, he makes this distinction between the aesthetics of politics and the politics of aesthetics. And for him, the aesthetics of politics, basically like making politics pretty and sexy, is a trait of fascism. So this whole historical aspect of the object with the aura that we've talked about, because it looks so good, it justifies any sort of crimes or horrors that might have been committed in the creation, acquisition, and survival of that particular object. It's making politics beautiful. He thinks on the other side that by providing photographs, by providing copies of films to everyone, you're actually bringing art into the realm of politics. So it's not just the realm of politics that is being hidden behind art, but it's art that's being brought into the realm of politics through the form of democracy, through the form of everybody is able to understand and appreciate the work of art as much as anybody else. So that text had a lot of echo. Once every 4 shows in the art world, one of them is titled like blah 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 in the age of mechanical reproduction, or blah 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 in the age of reproduction. So that was a very strong influence on thinking that was going to follow up after that. And one of the person who was influenced by that was André Malraux, which is one of the texts that is being commented on in the first reading that we had for this week. For a little bit of context, André Malraux was a writer, and he was also the first French Minister of Culture. So we're about in the 40s, 50s. The Second World War just ended, and so there's a reconstruction of all of the continent, and some new ways of thinking are being brought in the forefront. And what Malraux proposes is this imaginary museum, which is the foundation for what the author Batreau talks about as the virtual museum. So what is Malraux thinking when he talks about the imaginary museum? He's thinking of something like this, right? He's thinking of the ability for anyone to have a picture and to make their own book and to create their own edition in order to have a deeper understanding and a personal understanding of what they've just chosen. His process, and he was actually a book editor at some point, his process was to go through the different catalogs and then take out pictures, put them up together with the commentaries from the original curators or from the original scientific directors. And the original text, the Imaginary Museum, is just like 600 words or 700 words. It's very tiny. All the expression is done through his particular collection. As he assembles it, as he puts them together, he appropriates it, so he makes it his own, but he also uncovers new meanings through that process. And that's what the author talks about when they mentioned the metamorphosis. Things change when you change media. And that's what we talked about at the very beginning of the semester when we said that there's a strong emphasis on the medium, and that the medium is the message, as they say. The medium here is the unidimensional is not the right term, but it's the standard. So we were talking about the curatorial and the editing act as a creative act. It's no longer the symbol of the piece itself. It's the symbol of the piece itself as being chosen within a myriad of others. It's that selection process which gives it meaning. It's no longer just the piece itself. And that represents a particular world, right? Because if museums are going to be the displays of particular worldviews, whether they're scientific, historical, artistic, they are telling stories, and they're telling stories about the past, about the present, and possibly about the future. This allows us, by making our own books, by making our own catalogs, to tell our version of the story. And that was the 1950s way to do it. You needed to have a big apartment with a pair of scissors, a little bit of glue, and then put them all together. At this point, we have Benjamin talking about the democratic ideal of reproduction and the necessity of reproduction. We have Malraux talking about the ownership that the curation and the editing process brings. That sort of crystallizes in the thought of Nelson Goodman, which we talked about in week 6, and his proposal of how do you make an artwork function. So he said you can just let someone in front of the artwork, you can have someone tell someone what to think about the artwork, you can also just give them stuff from the gift shop. And what he means by that is that the gift shop and reproduction is something that prevents, that re-insufflates life into an artwork. If the artwork had a function before the 15th century, before the artist became this sort of romantic genius, lonely, solitary figure, if this artwork had a function, if a crucifix was a crucifix, if a Bible was a Bible before being the Gutenberg Bible, which ushered in the printing revolution and so on, if the artwork has lost that functionality by entering the museum and by entering the museum space, how do we insufflate life back into it? How do we make it so that this artwork is alive again because it has a purpose in some social setting or in some personal setting? And his suggestion is to give people postcards of the Mona Lisa and to give people sort of, some would say, cheap plaster casts of the David sculpture that's in Florence, or the Lovers by, what's his name, the sculptor? I forgot. It's a beautiful piece. So by giving those, you allow people to make it their own, right? And that relates to, interestingly enough, two different things which have the same name, namely constructivism. And constructivism on the one side is a pedagogical philosophy, which we're going to talk about next week when we talk about the specific education process of museums, in which essentially is a complicated ism for learning by doing, which we've been mentioning over and over so far. And the other constructivism is actually an art historical / graphic design movement or current from early 20th century in the USSR, which is the manifestation of the intent of bringing art to the masses. The thought behind the design version of constructivism is that now that we have those means of reproduction, now that we can have prints everywhere in every household, in every pocket, can we figure out a visual language, or can we figure out a new tendency in art history in which everybody, all the workers unite, all the workers have access to beauty and have a shared experience of that beauty that is not just top down from the king telling you this is a beautiful painting of me, enjoy the beautiful painting of me, but rather what is the bottom-up version of art. And that's what this other constructivism offered. So in Goodman's thought, there are these two things. There's the learning aspect, which by owning something and by manipulating it, you have a better chance at understanding it, or at least to develop a meaningful relationship with it, and that relationship will allow you to then learn things about it and to feel more concerned about what that object or what that reproduction actually is and actually means in a historical level. And then the other constructivism, which is, well, they're beautiful paintings, they're beautiful sculptures, we can reproduce them. Sure, they're not as beautiful as the original. It's still nice for people to have them in their room and to be able to put a poster, right? And so the educational and the aesthetic are the two segments of this thought. So we have those three guys, right? We have Benjamin, who thinks that reproduction is important for democratic purposes. We have Malraux, who thinks that it's important because the editing and the curatorial process happens through putting things together, and you discover new things by putting things together. And then you have Goodman, who thinks that your relationship with a piece only happens when you hold and you process that piece in the long term, not just through a museum visit. And so then museums have a problem, right? They have a problem because one of their original mission is to preserve the original artifacts. And they can't just say, well, we don't need the originals anymore because without originals you don't have a reproduction. So how do they renegotiate this possibility of, with the internet today, being able to copy an image as long as you have memory, and still defining the relationship between the reproduction, the reproduced, and the original, and without having either shadow the other.